And good evening, Lived Black Experience family, wherever you are in Northern Arizona, Georgia, Detroit, California, New Mexico, Mexico. We just found out that our broadcast now has reached Germany and other parts of Europe. So we're pretty stoked about that. We're very excited this evening we're still celebrating Dr. King and his legacy. And we thought that it would be very befitting to end January's broadcasting month with a focus on Queen Coretta Scott King, the woman who stood by King, was the wind beneath his wings, and a very phenomenal woman and leader in her own right. And so we're very excited to bring this broadcast to you. Sister Khara, good evening. How are you? And thank you so much for being here as our resident facilitator. And so if you would please get us started.
Absolutely. Well, I'm so excited to share in this presentation with you all. Coretta Scott King has always been a hero of mine, and so I am absolutely delighted that we are focusing on her today. We're going to start with a presentation on Coretta Scott before she became Mrs. King, and that presentation will be given by Ms. Denise TrimbleSmith, who is a native of Arizona, raised in the Phoenix area, and has lived in Tucson, South Central Los Angeles, and now Flagstaff. She is the coordinator of fraternity and sorority life at NAU and the owner and CEO of Courageous Conversations, LLC. Denise is the proud mother of 3 amazing daughters plus 2 bonus children, a former American Sign Language teacher, and 26-year member of Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority, Incorporated. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate another opportunity to have a lived Black experience and to come to you actually from my hometown of Phoenix, Arizona. I'm so excited to say thank you to the Northern Arizona community, especially that of Northern Arizona University. And through my lived experience, I have transitioned away from NAU. And sadly, I'm no longer the coordinator of fraternity and sorority life at Northern Arizona University, but rather I am down south at the University of Arizona, where I am currently proud to say Bear Down, Arizona. And thankfully, I have achieved a position there that's a lifetime goal, and that is the project director of diversity and inclusion there at U of A. So it's only been a week and a half, but I certainly miss Northern Arizona. I don't miss that snowstorm that you all had, but certainly so appreciative to be amongst sisters and other queens who have certainly highlighted and enhanced my life. I want to thank every one of you for taking the time to join us today. Oftentimes we hear so much about Dr. Martin Luther King, and of course, as we should. I do want to say there is that saying, behind every good man, there's an even greater woman. And so I'm so excited to talk to you about Coretta Scott King and the contributions that she has done to not just America, but to the world. But I would be remiss if I didn't also say that she did pass away in 2006 from ovarian cancer. And that's where you see the ribbon here on the screen in honor of that. I also want to give a shout out to my 13-year-old. She just turned 13 on Sunday, Corey Smith. She was one of my co-researchers. And so while she was the only kid in Phoenix that had 2 snow days, because she's still in the Flagstaff Unified School District, so I had to put her to work. But I told her she should have negotiated her contract before she started the job. But I had her do some of the research for me. So I want to thank her for all that she has done to contribute to today's conversation. Coretta Scott King, of course, before the dream and the early life of a queen, I was really excited to be assigned or to be asked to present about this particular part of her life, partially because I don't think that we share that much about her early childhood and her early parts of her life. So doing the research, it was really exciting. I took great courage in learning about her. Let's start off with Alabama. So she was born in Marion, Alabama in 1927. She's the second of 4 children to Obadiah Scott and Bernice McMurray Scott. I love these names. And I think that back then they weren't as creative maybe with some of the names like we have today. And you're gonna see some of these names repeated throughout Coretta Scott King and Dr. King's life. And they borrowed some of these names and even to name their own children. So it was kind of cool putting those puzzle pieces together. But yes, her father and her mother, they had a small farmhouse that they actually owned. And they owned it since, the Civil War. And so that was pretty intense for me because we often hear about the dangers of Black folk back in those days and even today, unfortunately, to own property. And so it was really encouraging to know that she came from good stock, if you will, where she had a spirit of ownership, had a spirit of responsibility, and taking on the role of being a pillar in her family. And thus she became a pillar in our community. Part of the great things about having a lived Black experience, some of you, whether you are African American or whether you're an ally, whatever your cultural background, ethnicity, many of us came from humble beginnings, and she was no different. Though her family owned the home, it was a small home, but the fact of the matter is that it was their home. And she has went on to tell us about sharing and sleeping in the same room with her parents and her siblings, all in one room. And so many of us can identify with having a similar lived experience. Something that was really important to me that I found out through our research is that her great-grandmother also lived in the home. And as you all know, or you will grow to understand, that the African-American family is so deep and has a depth and a breadth about her. The African-American family is rooted in matriarchal deference and respect. And that, of course, is a talk and a courageous conversation for another day. But even in my family, my grandmother lived with us until she died. And it was part of my makeup. It was part of who we were as a family. And in fact, even in early childhood, in elementary school, I was helping to take care of my grandmother. She too struggled with cancer. And she also had some emotional disconnects and some dementia. And so even in as early as 30 with my grandmother, as my mother was a single mom and she worked very hard, difficult hours. And so all of us, we had to pitch in and we had to contribute to the family. As you can see or will learn that so did Coretta Scott King. She was just an amazing young woman and showed great talents at an early age. However, that did not stop or take any pause in the responsibility that she had in the home. And so a lot of her life, I put, Dr. King and his beautiful wife, Coretta Scott King, on this pedestal of, oh my goodness, they had done so much for America, so much for the world. But when you really look at who she is, who she was, and the legacy that she's left behind, she really was a wonderful, but normal woman. And so sometimes that's kind of hard to take in, like, what? You want to put her on this pedestal, of course. But at the same time, you do take peace and solace in knowing wait a minute, she's just like me. She had ups and downs. She had some tumultuous parts of her childhood, as you can imagine, just thinking about the day and time of her existence, thinking about when she was born and throughout her lifetime. She had a lifetime of struggle. She had a lifetime of challenge. But there were some instances that she herself talked about in earnest and often. One of which is in her childhood. The ups was, yes, we already talked about her father owning property, owning the home, but he was also one of the first Black people to own a car in their town. But then the down, he owned the lumber mill later on, and it was burned down by some of the white neighbors because he refused to sell it to them. Then even as a teenager, during the Great Depression, Coretta Scott King, along with her siblings and her family, picked cotton. My family, we were cotton pickers and survivors of slavery. But even after enslavement, we continued the business of picking cotton. And I swear that is why one of the reasons, it's in our DNA, that we are such strong people. But even after that, I would say that was a drive for Coretta Scott King to continue her education. And she was determined to put education in the forefront, probably because of such hard work that she had to endure during her childhood and teenage years. She then follows in her sister's footsteps in college. And her sister was the first Black student to be a full-time student and live on the campus. Can you imagine, the first? So she had to be the only at one point. And so Coretta Scott King followed her in her sister's footsteps, and but yet she still faced discrimination. And when it came time for her to become a teacher, the school board refused to let her teach. But she didn't let that stop her. And she continued to build and to grow. One of the cool things that my daughter, Corey, who I mentioned before, she just said, Mama, you have to throw this in there. Coretta Scott King described herself as a tomboy. And I don't know that we hear that word very much anymore. I think that we want to try to use more inclusive language nowadays. And that's amazing that we have even gone that far. But she was very rough and tumble, if you will. She loved climbing trees and wrestling boys. She even had a cousin that she was much stronger than. And apparently that didn't go over well because she threatened to hit him with the axe. And then I thought it was just amazing that her aunt, like many of us aunties, kind of intervened. And then the auntie kind of threatened her a little bit and said, hey, you better get yourself together. So Coretta Scott King at that point decided maybe it was time for her to be a little bit more ladylike. Now, she also grew to have this amazing voice, and she was also a violinist. And that is key to her next steps in life. Her education from college to queen. She did graduate from high school as a valedictorian. And then, as I spoke of earlier, she enrolled in Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. But it was while she was in the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston, Massachusetts. That's where she met Dr. King, who wasn't a doctor at the time. He was actually in his doctoral program, and that's where they met. I thought that was simply amazing. I love these pictures and to see the transformation, but even till now, it just seems like her face in her latter years, she looks so much the same. There's a little saying in the African-American community that Black don't, and some of you can fill in the rest. Well, I think that she is proof of that for sure. She was finding her voice throughout her life. And all the while in finding her voice and being a trained concert singer and a violinist, she also was creating a legacy along the way. And I have a feeling that by tonight, you're going to learn quite a bit about her and her legacy. I love these images of them and their courtship. And you're going to learn about what it was like for her to be married to Dr. King and some of the things that she walked alongside, ran alongside him to make sure that we have the justices that were due, not just to African Americans, but to all people. And I just am so amazed by her. I said that she's royalty. We often refer to her and to the family as the Kings, but I promise you she's a queen. And I think of her as Black America's first lady. And she was just such a force to be reckoned with, and such an amazing role model to so many of the world. And now you think, if she was our first lady, African Americans from that time, even up until now, our first lady. But we think about someone else that most recently said, I may be the first, but I'm certainly not going to be the last. And I think about these women for sure. One thing that you should know about me, as was in my introduction, I am a proud member of Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated, and we are the baby sisters of the Divine Nine organizations. The oldest sister, or the oldest sorority, is Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, in which Coretta Scott King was a member. Now, I think that it just makes me feel so good. And that's why you'll see the colors that I tried to incorporate in this presentation. But we also know that her life and her early days and the importance that she played in education made an impact on many, including our true First Lady, of course, Michelle Obama. And even during her funeral service, President Barack Obama, who was a senator then, was honored in attending that service. But now in the latest days, we have celebrated having someone else in the White House, and that is Kamala Harris, who is also a proud member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. I couldn't let this presentation go by without honoring these ladies and thanking them that they may have been the first, but they're certainly not the last. I want to thank everybody for tonight. I had to show my daughter Corey that it's not okay to just do a presentation or write a paper and not cite your sources. And so here are the sources. And of course, a very special thank you to the good old Google, because I tell you what, Google doesn't fail you. You'll find what you need. And she certainly did in helping me with this presentation. I'm so blessed to have been able to do the research alongside my daughter. I'm so blessed to my youngest daughter. I have a whole family, but it was so important for her to see some of the same things, the synonymous lived Black experiences, even from Coretta Scott King to herself, to myself, my mother, Selena Fields, who I hope is watching. I'm just so blessed to see that we aren't that different. And if we're not that different, then we still have a job to do, and we still have endless possibilities. It's not just okay for us to stop where we are. It's certainly okay to dream and have a dream, but we all know a dream is not the stopping point. We have to remember that it's vision. Vision without action is simply a picture. And so don't let our lives and our lived Black experience just be a dream. Make it happen, and be sure to continue to honor Coretta Scott King and being a trailblazer that she was. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation and introduction to her life. And I love the way that you framed her experiences and her early story. And we look forward to engaging with you further in our open question and answer section as well. Just as a reminder to our audience, we're seeing folks participating in the chat. If you have questions on any of the presentations, we encourage you to put those into the chat so we can ask them during the Q&A. Up next, we have a presentation on Mrs. Scott King, so her transition from Coretta Scott to Coretta Scott King and her work alongside Dr. King. That presentation will be given by Ms. Ramona Curtis. Ms. Ramona Curtis is the Director of Diversity Outreach Programs at Tulsa Community College. She is responsible for diversity outreach programs, including the Diversity Center. She retired from Baylor University in 2019 after 19 years of service. Over the past few decades, she has spearheaded many initiatives to promote diversity, including the church swap, an attempt to dismantle the most segregated hour in America. She has coordinated Undoing Racism, a program which focuses on understanding racism and how we can all work together to undo its negative effects. She speaks throughout the world on leadership, diversity, and other professional development topics. She holds a bachelor's in communication from the University of Texas at Arlington, a master's of sociology from Prairie View A&M University, and is currently a doctoral student at Prairie View A&M University studying educational leadership. Welcome, Ms. Curtis. We're so happy to have you back.
To talk about Ms. Coretta Scott King from the perspective of feminism. I want to also bring about the second shift, which is a sociological term that many women face in America, having a full-time job and then going home and taking care of kids and the home. Also want to talk about her music. Being a professional singer, I want to just talk about that impact and how she used her voice in that perspective, and then her place in the movement, and then just as a wife and a mother. I want to be able to share with you those things about Coretta. So as we talk about, I love Coretta Scott when she talks about the force. Segregation is wrong, and she believed that it was still wrong, even no matter what the race of people are who are trying to separate themselves from others. But in her relationship with Martin and walking along Martin through this, and they married during the second wave of feminism. And so after they dated and married, it was the second wave of feminism, and it was commonplace to tell a woman what she should be or what she ought to be and do. And so she had been fighting against intersectionality of race and sex even throughout her not her childhood, but more of her high school and college years. But she had a very strong mother who taught her and her sisters that they needed a life beyond just being a wife, that she wanted them to share that independence, even if they did meet and marry the person of their dream. But she did acknowledge throughout her life that there were complications of being both a female and being African American, particularly during the time that she was walking alongside Martin during the movement and prior to the movement. And she talks about in her autobiography how she questioned whether or not Dr. King really knew her strength. And unfamiliar with her mother. As a matter of fact, he met her mother and father for the first time when they were married. But she recalled in her autobiography that Martin asked her, told her that he needed a wife who was going to be home and take care of the children. And she told Martin that she wanted to be a part of this work. And Dr. King told her that he was called to the work and she wasn't. But after a heartfelt conversation, she acknowledged that Dr. King was still encouraging of her after she told him that as she spoke of her experiences with segregation, with being in white spaces and what that meant. And even as she talked in her own reflections of dating a Jewish, she dated a white man who was Jewish, and she talked about how when she was going to meet their parents, they were going to eat at a restaurant, but yet they could not eat at this restaurant. Her boyfriend didn't think about Coretta being Black, and so they met her parents, and they were going to this particular restaurant, and Coretta said, "Where am I going to eat?" And then it dawned on her that she could not eat at the same place with this white family. So, you know, she had all those different types of experiences that Dr. King didn't understand, that she was fighting for these very rights as well in college, and felt called to that movement, being a part of many organizations in college that led her to want more for her people, for herself and for her people. Perhaps her early relationship with Dr. King, she found herself as being a strong, independent woman with a history of self-love for herself, but she wanted to control her own destiny because that's what her mother taught her. Her mother taught her and her sister to be more than just a wife, and she wanted to find her place in being more than just a wife. As you remember, in this second wave of feminism, women were still somewhat considered property. Dr. King was a Baptist minister. He was not shy about what he wanted in a wife. He wanted a stay-at-home mom. He wanted someone that could hold together a home while he went out and was a pastor, and he wanted someone who was going to be this first lady. But Coretta knew her calling, but she also loved Martin so. And so they did make a lot of compromises. And so she, because of her love for Martin and her respect for Martin, they married, and she did become a housewife. She got to know Martin's dreams as they chatted, as they had fun together. And she put it in place that we're one heart, we're one soul, we can do this together. So she ended up being a part of the work that he did, editing speeches, helping him through speeches, talking to him and talking about the movement and those things that were important to him, and then the input that she would have in supporting him in those areas. The second shift, though, is very tough when you are trying to be a part of the movement in support of your husband, but yet you are also starting a family. So she worried when she had to leave her children during the time that she was following Dr. King or speaking at freedom concerts. She also knew that the burden she had placed on, the burden that was placed on the women that kept the children while she was gone, she even felt sorry for them. So she felt she didn't want to leave her kids, but she wanted to be a part of the movement because it was part of her passion. This was part of something she wanted to do too. It wasn't just about her following Dr. King. It was about her working towards this beloved community that she talked about, this community where people of all races could be together. And she saw visions of that as well. Those passionate pieces of Dr. King resonated with her long before she had met King as well, Dr. King as well. But balancing that, she found it very hard. She knew that being a mother was important, and she wanted to participate in her children's life, but at the same time, she felt frustrated because she was torn between her love for the movement and what was going on, and the fact that she did have responsibilities. And so she confided, she talks about confiding in Harry Belafonte. They were friends, and she would share some of her frustrations. So Harry Belafonte decided that he would he would take care of her housekeeping. He'd pay someone to take care of her housekeeping and the child rearing expenses, so that she could go ahead and wouldn't have to worry about being away from the kids and whether or not they were being taken good care of. But Dr. King did not want it to appear that his family was living some type of elitist life during this movement. He wanted to stay humble. He did not care about fancy cars. He did not care about fancy shoes and clothes and any of that. Even Coretta had to talk him into getting them a house, because he wanted to use humility. He wanted the people he spoke to see that he's right there with them where the rubber meets the road, in challenging those pieces. And most of the money that he did make during that time, he put it back into the movement. It was back into the movement. It wasn't for self-gain. It was for the greater good. Now, in terms of music, and I know I only have 15 minutes, so I'm hoping I'm not going over, but in terms of music, what an incredible professional singer Coretta King was. And music was a great part of her life. And she wanted to be a concert singer. And she found a way to use her professional talent throughout the movement. She never saw herself as doing anything but performing music and not necessarily speaking, but she did perform music during those times in the movement. As a matter of fact, when Dr. King would speak, she usually sang during whenever he presented and they were there together. But then she found her voice and found herself being comfortable with singing. But then when she started doing the Freedom concerts, she found herself speaking before she would sing. So she did find an opportunity to use her talent as a place in the movement. And that all started, she talks about it. Her whole ideal of speaking during the movement started on March 9th, 1958, at the annual Women's Day address in Denver at New Hope Baptist Church. She said, the title of her speech is, I will never turn back, and if I perish, I perish. And I have to tell you, Coretta had such a strong fortitude for the work that was being done in the movement. She thought, if something happened to Martin and something happened to me, where would my children be? But she thought about Esther in the Bible, and she said, you know what? God is on our side. And so I will never turn back from this movement and what I know. And if I die fighting for these freedoms. She felt that her path and her calling was much greater, and it was a calling from God. And she knew that God would take care of her and her kids, or if she were to die, that God would take care of her kids. It was then that she knew that she had stepped into a bigger stage, and she was part of this greater movement. She was, even in the middle of going to jail to visit Martin, the many times that he was arrested or going to protest, she spoke out just boldly. Never did she think she would speak against so many people, but she just really, the watching the way her husband and other protesters were treated, she even felt like she needed to be more a part of that movement. And she just despised the difficulty that her husband kept having with Bull Connor. She was a witness to so many committed people, even the young people. She talked about how the young people gave her so much energy to stay in the fight, despite the hoses, despite the dogs, because she had seen so many victories. She saw the bus boycott, and then after, when they went to Birmingham to see all of the wrong that was done there was still the resilience of the people, and things began to change. She saw things change little by little. They were changing with this movement, and she realized that she, as well as her husband, was a part of something so big. But she still was a wife, and she still was a mother, even though she felt this calling to be a part of the movement. She still worried so much about what would happen with Martin. She was, as she put it, sick and tired of being sick and tired. But she give, and I forgot to say this part during feminism, because it's important to say this part about feminism and when she, what she did during the movement. The March on Washington was an exciting time for her. She could not wait, and she was ready to get there and ready to be up on stage on the platform and march with the many people who were marching and hear from many speakers. And although she wanted a diversity of speakers, she found out that the men in the movement, in that patriarchal spirit, did not allow women to speak. And she was heartbroken, and she wanted to talk to Martin about that. But she said, you know, there's a greater position. I'll hold my peace because there's a greater position. But she named off Fannie Lou Hamer is here, and Ralph Abernathy's Mrs. Abernathy is here, and so many people are here, and the only woman on the platform here to say anything is Mahalia Jackson, and she would sing. And so she was pretty taken aback about that. And even when Dr. King went to speak to the president, a delegation from the movement went to speak to the president, they did not allow the women to go into that meeting either, because they said it was out of order and it was against protocol. And she really, that resonated with her, and because her mother raised her to be independent, but she did not speak much about that at that time with Dr. King, because she knew that there was a greater good, and she did not want to start that friction during that time. But as a mother, I will say, and during that time that Dr. King, during the time of the movement, when Dr. King was away a lot, she would always have to explain to her children when their dad was coming home, or where she was going, as she traveled extensively, and the kids had to have a caretaker. But one of the pieces that she talked about was explaining to her children when they were teased, when Dr. King was arrested in Birmingham, and the children were teased and bullied. She set her kids down because kids were calling their dad a jailbird, and she had to talk to them and wanted them to know that yes, bad people go to jail, but dad is in jail to make things different and better for everyone, for the greater good of society. And she was always having these conversations with her children about their dad, and about the movement, and about how important it is to be resilient, and how important it is to live with purpose, and to be spiritual individuals, and live out your calling. And in the end, even though Martin passed away, and she talks so eloquently in her autobiography, she writes so eloquently the night and what was going on, as she talked to Martin, and how down he seemed, but the next day he was peppy, and just a whole different Martin that next day. And she recalls him just saying that he spoke with God that night, and things were just better. And when he showed up to the crowd to give the mountaintop speech, although Coretta was not there, it just seemed like everything was coming together in terms of being at peace with his work being done. And the way she presented it to her children, as she presented herself after Dr. King died, she said that she never showed her emotions in public, but she cried at home and at night on her own. But she wanted everyone to see that this is work, and this is a price to pay for the work that's being done. And she said nothing could be more, could help more than continuing Martin's dream, keeping Martin's spirit alive, making sure that it never died. And she felt like that was part of her calling, as they killed the physical body of my husband, but they did not kill his spirit. And I truly believe when you read about Coretta and her upbringing, and her passion for equality and for unity, and then meeting a man who's so committed from that. She said they just beat at the same drum, their hearts beat together. And so in closing with this, what I took from this is that Coretta's courageous spirit led her to do more for breaking barriers for other groups, because of the way she was treated early on and her work in the movement. And so I'll leave that there, and I look forward to having questions afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I was having some mouse troubles. Couldn't unmute myself there for a second. Thank you again so much for that presentation. Again, to our audience, if you have questions for any of the presentations, please be sure to share those in the comments, and we will try and get to those during our open Q&A. Up next, we have a presentation on Coretta Scott King's conversation with John F. Kennedy during the 1960 presidential election, which has been credited by historians for mobilizing African-American voters. That presentation will be given by Dr. Natasha Howard. Natasha Howard is an assistant professor of communication arts at the Community College of Baltimore County. Her areas of specialization include representation of the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and respectability in the media, with a particular focus on Black women, women's studies, and hip hop culture. She is a co-editor of the book Black Women in Popular Culture, The Conversation Continues in 2014, and has been published in both academic and popular outlets on topics pertaining to the representation of Black women in the media and popular culture. Welcome, Dr. Howard.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so thank you. So I'm here today to talk about a small event that had very long-lasting impact, and that is in fact considered to be pivotal in terms of changing the course of history, in terms of the majority of the Black vote and where the Black vote went in this country. So this event was a 90-second phone call that was with then Senator John F. Kennedy that he made to Mrs. King following the arrest of Dr. King in October 1960. And then so I want to give a disclaimer that unlike the other panels, this event, it did involve Mrs. King, but at the same time, the emphasis behind it was more so the background that took place in order for the call to take place, and then what happened afterwards. And in fact, Mrs. King was actually kind of a small part of the story. So to begin, on October 19th, 1960, as you see, Dr. King was arrested with about 35 other protesters for participating in a sit-in at the restaurants and lunch counters at the department store Rich's in Atlanta, Georgia. Unlike the other protesters, however, Dr. King was held without bail and was actually sentenced to 4 months of hard labor working the state road gang in the Georgia State Prison as a result of his participation. The fear as a result of that, there was a lot of panic because of the fact that with the prison being far away and then him being having to work with the road gang with other criminals who had harsher penalties that resulted in them being in prison, there was just the concern about his safety. And so this event in itself is what frames the circumstance of the call. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, well, I'm going to keep going. Okay, so to set the scene, you really have to get into the idea of what was going on, which was the 1960 presidential election. The race was between the Democratic candidate, which was then Senator John F. Kennedy, and also Richard Nixon, who was then the vice president. At the time, at the time, Senator Kennedy was from Massachusetts. He was known to be from a wealthy family. His family name was known, but as a politician, there wasn't as much known about him. And also one thing to consider at that time, the Democrat Party was more so associated with Southern Democrats, in particular, the Southern Democrats who opposed integration and civil rights. At the time, in order to keep the white vote, Kennedy had met with Governor Vandiver in Georgia and promised him that as president, he would not send troops to enforce integration of schools, but in private, because he did want to, of course, because he wanted to win and he wanted to try and listen to some of the leaders on the civil rights movement. He would meet with them on the side to try and convince them that he would be an aggressive civil rights president. On the other hand, though, you had the Republican Party with Richard Nixon. Now, and at the time, the Republican Party was very much still considered the party of Lincoln. And so with that being said, that was considered the party that many affluent African Americans, leaders in the community, had already chosen to be the person that they were going to vote for. And the thing to keep in mind is that Richard Nixon was vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, who was president during and had signed the 1957 Civil Rights Act. And it also, at that time, he was president during Brown versus Board of Education. And a lot of different things that had happened in the early civil rights movement while that administration was taking place. Not to say that that administration was out and pro civil rights, it's just that those things were taking place at the same time. But as a result, because of that, you can see in the picture there, it was pretty much assumed that the Black vote was going to go to Nixon. In fact, Dr. King was said to consider, at the time, Richard Nixon a friend, saying that Nixon would sometimes contact him for counsel or advice. Now, the election in 1960, at the time, the civil rights movement was full swing. But like I mentioned, the Brown versus Board of Education had already taken place. The Montgomery bus boycott had already taken place. And so civil rights and the argument to end segregation was a very big subject. But the problem was that neither candidate wanted to talk about. And so this is where the sit-ins came in. According to Mrs. King in her autobiography, Dr. King had apparently not wanted to actually participate in the sit-ins, but he was talked into it by the leaders in SNCC, the Southern, because they basically argued that if he participated, it would bring bigger attention to their cause and then force both presidential candidates to have to address the issue of segregation. And indeed, Dr. King's arrest actually did do that. Now, see, the thing about Dr. King's arrest and his sentencing being so harsh, just as an additional backstory, is the fact that unlike the other protesters, unbeknownst to Dr. King at the time, he was still on probation for a traffic violation that he had received. And that May, he and Mrs. King were driving writer Lillian Smith, who happened to be a white woman, to Emory University, where she was receiving treatment for cancer. At that time, apparently police officers often pulled over groups or cars where they would see that there'd be interracial groups basically driving together. And so as a result, they pulled them over, and Dr. King was given a citation for driving with out-of-state license, because he had been living in Georgia for 3 months at that time, and they said he still had a license from Alabama. So as a result, he ended up getting a $25 fine, but also being placed on probation, which his lawyer in negotiating the deal did not happen to mention to Dr. King. And so when he was arrested for the sit-ins, because of this arrest being a violation of his probation, he was given a harsher sentence as a result. So moving on with that, this sets the scene for the phone call. So this panicked the family, especially Mrs. King. At the time, she was pregnant with their third child, and just the fears, the concerns that she had in terms of what could have happened. As a matter of fact, they found out later that when Dr. King was transferred from jail to the Georgia State Prison, they did it in the middle of the night. And he was basically alone in a patrol car driving at night with these two officers and a German Shepherd, 230 miles away. So just he wrote about basically the fright, the fear that you have in those situations, because at that time, so many times when that same kind of scenario took place, you would often have very negative and often fatal results. Looking at this event, which did gain national attention, both sides, Republicans and Democrats, had to weigh the option on whether they wanted to speak out. And there were definitely many Black leaders across the civil rights movement, even Jackie Robinson, who was a fervent Nixon supporter, were pushing either side to basically make a statement. Jackie Robinson apparently even met with Nixon and left very disappointed because Nixon said that he was not going to make a statement. But behind the scenes, it was said that Nixon was trying to get the charges dropped, but his efforts were denied. In terms of Kennedy, to be clear, his camp was not pro trying to make a statement either. With the outlier being Sergeant Shriver, who was the head of the civil rights section of Kennedy's campaign, and Harris Walford, who was an aide that was also a friend of the Kings. Behind the scenes, apparently beforehand, Kennedy had tried to call the governor of Georgia to ask what could be done about freeing Dr. King. And after not really getting a straight answer, he seemed to basically just settle that was going to be it. But because again, to just really sort of emphasize this, the major issues that Kennedy was facing in terms of making a statement about civil rights or even helping Dr. King was the fact that he was out and right told by one of the governors of the South that if any candidate supported Khrushchev, Jimmy Hoffa, or Dr. King, so they lumped them all together, then they would not get their votes. So he had that pressure. His campaign manager, who was his brother Bobby Kennedy, definitely was not in favor of him doing anything that was going to jeopardize the campaign so close to the election. So at this time, you have panicked Mrs. King trying to figure out what can be done. She calls her friend Harris Walford to basically, because she knew that he was involved with the campaign, with her fears. But knowing that it wasn't likely Kennedy was going to make a direct statement, the idea came to him that a way that could possibly have impact was if he were to make a phone call to Mrs. King. It'd be simpler, it'd be less controversial. And even with that small gesture, there was the hope that maybe the word would get out, and as a result, that could be beneficial to him. So Walford took took this idea to Shriver, who was said to use his in-law privilege because he was the in-law of Senator Kennedy at the time, and basically got him, passed the idea to him, and Kennedy agreed with it. He was like, sure, why not? So in terms of this call and this is all the backstory to it. The call itself was about 90 seconds, no longer than 2 minutes. In her autobiography, Coretta recounted that after a brief greeting, Kennedy expressed his concern for her and Martin, saying, I know this must be very hard for you. I understand you are expecting your third child, and I just wanted you to know that I was thinking about you and Dr. King. If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know. It closed with her telling him that she appreciated his concern and they welcome any assistance. And that was it. That was the gist of the phone call. It wasn't this long conversation or anything of the such. But it was what happened afterwards that really made that phone call be considered significant. So Kennedy waited until the next day, actually, to even tell anyone on his campaign that he made this phone call, whereas Mrs. King immediately called her mother-in-law, Martin's mother, and shared the news. So when it was found out that originally when Bobby Kennedy found out that he had made this call, he was furious, especially because at the time, Kennedy was on his way to take a trip to New York. And as soon as he got off the plane, a reporter asked him about this call because word had spread. So news has gotten out. And it's interesting because Kennedy said that that Mrs. King was a friend. And so as a result, he was concerned, despite the fact that he had never met or talked to Mrs. King before. And he actually, I believe they never met in real life ever. So, but after Bobby Kennedy got over his anger about the call, he sprung into action. He contacted the judge, Judge J. Oscar Mitchell, and the judge ended up having a change of heart in the next on Thursday, October 27th, 1960, Dr. King was released on a $2,000 bond. Now, while Kennedy and his campaign did not make the call public, they did capitalize on the fact that it was made public. So what you see there with the no comment Nixon, they basically printed out pamphlets that they had sent on Greyhound buses to churches throughout multiple states, throughout the Black community, so they could be distributed to basically emphasize the fact that Senator Kennedy called and Nixon had no comment about the whole situation. But one of the biggest influences was actually Martin's father, Daddy King, who was a Republican and had made it very clear, talking about how he had planned to vote for Nixon, but he announced at a standing room only meeting, actually, that that because of this, even though originally he had not planned to vote for Kennedy, that he changed his mind basically, and that he was going to. And this news and this influence sent ripples throughout the Black community around the country. When Dr. King was released, he did thank Senator Kennedy, saying that he heard he'd been instrumental in his release, saying for him to be that courageous shows that he is really acting upon principle and not expediency. He also shared that Dr. King also shared that he hadn't heard anything from Vice President Nixon and didn't know of any Republican efforts being made on his part. And even later in his life, Dr. King, when referring to Nixon, referred to him as a moral coward. So it really was, in the end, this silence from the Republican Party, and then this small gesture that made this gesture of this phone call really stand out. And of course, the publicity about that. In the end, it was counted that of the 100,000 votes that JFK had over Nixon, it included a significant amount of Black voters. The change was such that they said that in this 1960 election, 70% of Black voters voted Democrat in comparison to 1956, where the Black vote was 60% Republican. So it really did make a huge shift, essentially, that we still in many ways see today. It was said afterwards in Nixon's subsequent campaigns for president, because of this, he ceased even trying to court the Black vote. There are a lot of things that could be added into it, but basically the effects of this call by reaching out to Mrs. King as a connection to Dr. King and thereby the Black community created a very significant change in voting trends. And that's all I have.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Again, we have question and answer coming up. If you have questions for any of the presenters, please be sure to share them in the comments. And we are going to move on to a presentation about Coretta Scott King after the assassination, carrying on, and what happened in her life after Dr. King's death. In addition to establishing the King Center in Holiday, she also fought for LGBTQIA rights and women's rights. So we're going to learn a bit more about her ongoing fight for civil rights in our country. Giving this presentation will be Dr. Treya Allen. Dr. Allen is a program manager for diverse and inclusive advising practices at the University of Arizona and a faculty member at a community college. Her research covers the intersection of Black women in education, specifically higher education. She is the curator of underground retention programs, auntie networks, and most recently, the developer of an African American Studies program at Pima Community College. Welcome, Dr. Allen.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I just want to make sure, good? Are we good?
I'm sorry, you cut out for me a little bit there. I can hear you.
Well, thank you for having me again. And I want to talk about a little bit about Coretta's legacy. So one of the things I want to start with are just these considerations. And that is, if we just consider the legacy of Coretta Scott King as the companion or as simply the companion work of MLK's feats, we miss the roles she played in our understanding of the civil rights movement as a whole, the shaping of our current world, the current world that we live in, and the shaping of Kingian philosophy, because she is the architect of the King legacy, if you will. And if we also then limit our understanding of her commitment to the movement of nonviolence, poverty eradication, and human rights as a function of gender, we can't fully and clearly understand the depth and the breadth of her contributions to how we understand the civil rights movement, or just the ways that we make meaning. And then finally, Coretta Scott King's legacy doesn't just begin once she meets MLK, as many of my sisters said. It actually started well before any of her time with MLK. So, I love absolute beautiful pictures of them together because, one, I think it demonstrates commitment not only to each other but also to the movement. But then I think a lot of times when we think of K and his legacy, we rarely hear the voice of Coretta Scott King. So during my presentation, I just want to, like, as much as possible, allow her to speak for herself. One of the things that she always says is that we didn't have a his and hers mission. We were one soul, one goal, one love, one dream. And the movement had become embedded in my DNA, meaning it was not something I could choose or refuse. I knew I had to do all that was in me, had to focus on keeping the dream alive. So what we find out is after MLK is assassinated, she's actually one of the first people to use the word assassinate instead of murder. The two are very different. Assassinate meaning the station killing, and one of the ones who was very vocal in pointing out that no, indeed, my husband was assassinated, and I believe that had a lot to do with it. So after the assassination of MLK, what we find, she's quickly sucked into these very three distinct roles. One was as, of course, she now moves from being the wife to the widow of MLK. She still has to be a mother to her children, but real quickly she becomes the emperor of nonviolence. And so, as I believe Ramona said, one of the things that happens is she would not grieve in public because she felt like she had to be the voice of reason and strength, and she also had to comfort people. So one of the quotes that she always talks about, or that she talked about a lot in her autobiography, is that when she came out of her bedroom, she said, I had to leave my feelings, my heartaches, and my anxieties behind. I had been out of the fog of painful reality in a zone where I could perform as a mother and comfort others. So really quickly, she moves into this mothering role. Now, while Rosa Parks is acknowledged as the mother of the civil rights movement, Coretta Scott King in this time has to quickly become the comforter, because it was not just her children who lost MLK. It wasn't just who lost MLK, but an entire nation had lost MLK. And so one of the reasons to that were a bunch of riots, right? It's all over to honor, if you will, the work of the Prince of Nonviolence. So she really, in this moment, says that while she understood the language of the desperate, meaning the language of despair, she really had to make sure that she upheld this commitment to nonviolence. So in continuing movement, she talks about what she had to do after Martin had basically been assassinated. One thing that oh goodness, we're taking down sharing. Oh, very, very sorry. There seems to be a ton of people on the internet at my house. But one of the things I want to share about her is that she believed that her immediate concerns were to continue her campaign against the war in Vietnam, and she had to continue to fight for livable wages for the contribution of workers, as well as continue pushing forward what Martin had fought for and gave his life for. So in answer to the call to continue work, she said she understood clearly after raising her children, she had one goal, and that goal was to continue pushing the work of MLK and not allowing God, and also following God as he ordered her steps. And continuing that work, she wanted other people to be able to duplicate work. So you see her in several areas in life. One of the biggest ones she ran out with really quick was the advocacy for full employment and anti-poverty. And so that with workers, standing for the fair treatment of workers and a livable wage. And this is very much the same thing that we see happening today. We're still fighting for that livable wage. And this is where she says that the ministry of presence was made clear to her, meaning it just showed up that the influence of who she was often got things done. Another part of her legacy is the crafting of the King Center for Nonviolent Social Change. And it's not just a building that she was crafting, it was also this commitment extending the legacy of MLK work, but also, in doing so, he also went ahead and restored this Auburn neighborhood, and that included the historical preservation of the childhood home of MLK, the historical preservation of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, and what was then MLK Jr. Natatorium. The original one was torn down in 2012, but then the new one was just recreated and built not too long ago. The MLK Center also includes the Freedom Center that houses I believe, a 250-seat auditorium, as well as the King Archives, one of the large collections of King's Archives. The part of archives really helping to out this principle on violence you see here on the screen, really making sure that not only those who are in America knew, but also around the world. And she essentially teaches not just America, but other countries this principles of and also to how those principles of violence. The biggest thing for beloved community and being able to beloved community, and so as it's defined by Dr. MLK here on the screen, beloved community for her was not just something that we say. Isn't this utopia? It was a global in which we can share both of the earth. And in beloved community were three things were highly that would not be tolerated, and it was poverty, racism, and war or militarization. Now, wasn't just able to do with opposition. What we find out is that she actually encountered a lot of opposition from the very people who walked alongside her husband, Hosea Williams being one. I forget other individual's name, but government officials, even Nixon, right? President Nixon, who when she was trying to pull together the monies and the resources to build King Center, Hosea Williams, other aides to MLK really were reminding her ability to do so. And even Abernathy, one of Dr. King's aides, made a comment in public, something to the effect of Coretta basically her fundraising to build the King Center, taking money from the SCLC. Her outspokenness about things like Vietnam War and poverty also basically called FBI to veil her as well. And government officials, not just president, but actual people said it could work. Also, those were the oppositions she faced, but she still overcame. She really had a well, she is no longer with us, but she had a huge influence in political activism and organization building. She is probably Hurricane King, or the reason why Carter's into office. But not only that, she utilizes her connections and the ministry to make social changes, and is probably one of the reasons why so many Black judges were placed in it to benches under Carter. Also brought her principles of nonviolence to South Africa, and the King Center and this nonviolence movement and principles of nonviolence are key, and were key in the transition of South Africa democratic republic, or sorry, a democratic government with the election of Nelson Mandela. And then we most know her, we also know her as the biggest advocate of the MLK holiday. We should, what I also want people to understand, even though this was signed into law by Reagan in 1983, it wasn't until 1986 was actually when we had the first honoring of this law. And then even then it took 32 years for everyone, the 50 states of the United States to actually honor this. In Arizona alone, we didn't start this holiday until 93, and we only did it because we wanted to make sure that we could get the Super Bowl. Other things that you want to consider about this is that her first battle was getting the holiday, and then the second battle was getting the holiday observed by 50 states. She was also very, very big in human rights advocacy. So she was a public delegate to the United Nations under the Carter administration. She, as much as she could, introduced nonviolent strategies to the UN. And she actually is one who starts talking about this concept of intersectionality before it was even called intersection by Kimberly Crenshaw. She was also a proponent of LGBTQ rights, with first mention in 1977, although she didn't make a public statement. She had private conversations, and those private conversations at the 1977 Women's Conference on the basically the position in the United States, those conversations really started a lot of talk. At that same convention, there wanted some women wanted a plaque really defining marriage as between man and wife, or man and woman, but she refused. Also stating a lot of the LGBTQ community was right alongside her husband in fighting for civil rights. She offered is if a basic right of one group can be denied, all groups become vulnerable. And really important for me and for everyone who's reading about her legacy is we really got to see that she still speaks. Even though she has been gone from 2006 and she is then, her most recent vocal hearing her Senator Elizabeth Warren attempted to read the statement that she made about sessions during the last presidential administration, and Elizabeth Warren being silenced, and the vote silence to silence Elizabeth Warren. Now, I know that there were a lot of campaigns that came out that talked about we're really trying to silence Warren, but I think really what we should stand back and think about is how powerful the Ministry of Presence is to pull a historical document of a foremother movement who had at this point passed away, and to still have that document movement so that the entire Republican Senate and House wanted silence Elizabeth speaks a lot about even now the influence of Coretta Scott King. And so finally, I would just offer that if you want to learn more about her, we've been talking about her autobiography all night, that please feel free to get her autobiography that's listed here on the screen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allen. We're going to move into our question and answer period. Unfortunately, Ms. TrimbleSmith had to leave us for another commitment, but we did have questions for each of you, so I look forward to continuing the conversation. And actually, I'll start with you, Dr. Allen, because so much of what you shared, it just makes me think of the importance of legacy and how much of Mrs. King's became wrapped up in that of her husband. So I think it's important for us to talk about the importance of her legacy and all of those things that she was able to accomplish, and her leadership and her passion for creating change and continuing that work. So if you can just speak to what is most important for us to know about the legacy of Coretta Scott King as a person and as a queen of the Black community.
I think one of the really important things is this: while we honor MLK, this is not about putting legacies up against one another. It's really one. Her of continuing legacy is really being led by that the movement was bigger than her. It was bigger than okay. It was big position. She just had to keep going. And I think that's something that we don't talk about at all, but that we definitely need to center when we through the work she did. That it was bigger than her, or okay, or even King Center, but the influence and the impact is global.
Yeah, I wonder if any of the other presenters just want to speak about her impact in your lives as individuals. How has she influenced you or impacted you or inspired you in your own lives?
Well, I'll go ahead and say that it was such a pleasure to talk about Coretta, to learn more about her and her spirit, to be a trailblazer. She was a trailblazer for women, for Black women, even as she left the South going to school in Boston and being brave enough to really use her voice. What I learned in this is that so many times we see Coretta Scott King as Dr. King's wife, and she was so much more than that. And I think there are so many young women, from little girls to college women, who need to know that Martin's dream was hers. She didn't learn about things when she met and married Martin. She was already living the movement, the spirit of the movement. She'd already had all those experiences. And I think a lot of times too, we want to think that she was born in an elitist family. She comes from humble beginnings to be this very prim and proper social justice advocate. That's what I'm taking from her story. We did not know and value what she gave as young women before she passed away. I just don't think we held her as high, and she was so humble, so she didn't brag about it. You know, she was humble. She didn't brag about it. But to the Scott King family that are still living, their mother was phenomenal. She was just phenomenal. To be courageous to tell someone who was as patriarchal as Dr. King that, hey, I'm going to be a part of this movement. This is not just your dream. This is not just your passion. This is not just a place for a man. Gosh, she just made my spirit feel so good.
Yeah. I want to keep us going on that conversation, because I think that's so important, is that idea that she was more than, we heard about how important her role as a mother was and her role as a wife, but she was so much more than just the wife of Dr. King. She was her own person, and she had her own voice. And I think it's really important that we talk about the voice that she had and her passion for the voice of other women to be heard. I think Dr. Curtis, Ms. Curtis, it was you who spoke about that and her disappointment in other women not being allowed to speak at different events. And I will admit, I'm going to kind of selfishly frame this with my own experience. When I was around 11 or 12, I actually had the opportunity to meet and speak with Mrs. King at a symposium back in Pennsylvania and ask her a couple questions. And that was one of the things that she said even then. This would have been back in the mid-90s, I think. But one of her statements in response to one of the questions was that she so seldom got asked about herself. She was so often, her story was so wrapped up in that of Dr. King's that she didn't often get to share her own perspective and those sorts of things. And it wasn't said in a negative way, but still just continuing to reflect on the importance of her own passions and her own voice. So can we talk a little bit more about what was so unique about her voice and the arguments that she made, the work that she did, and I think that contributes as well to the importance of the voices of Black women in important social and political movements. So I'll start with you, Ms. Curtis, and then go to Dr. Howard, if you have any thoughts on that, and then Dr. Allen.
Well, I think one of the things that that she's shown, and I think that we have to think about how those voices, how her story is so important today, even in politics. I think that Coretta Scott King showed that when you understand the purpose of something bigger, then you find your place in it and you find your voice. I don't think she could have done that without finding her voice. She would not have been comfortable just being at home. And so I think the message between men and women as we wrestle with the issues in politics, whether it be pay or whether it be what jobs are women or men or who should run for office and what should be the issues of the day. I think having us working together and being able to have a voice that is neutral, where you're listening to the message of a person. You talk about tone policing. Back in the day, men tone police women in terms of what they were to do and who they ought to be. And I thought that the character of Coretta Scott King, to be able to tell her husband, who was so strong in that you will not tone police me. You will not tone police me. And she would say that to any other men that were part of that movement as well. And she was courageous in that. So I think even in politics today, as we have a vice president who's a female, I think even we as women are going to have to be careful tone policing when she speaks, when she's in front of crowds. I think that we all have to do that. It is not something that was back then. That feminism is still alive and well in this third, or some say this is the fourth wave of feminism. We still haven't gotten that voice that we can do what men do. We can be in politics and we can fight for those issues in politics, and we should be able to be heard in those areas. And I hope I'm answering that question, because that's exactly what we have. We have a vice president. You look at Michelle Obama. One of the things that I loved about her, when she went to go speak at places and people came after her, you know what she said? I don't do this well. Either we're going to listen to the protest, or you're going to listen to me. I don't do this well. My husband is the president. I'm going to call things out. I'm not going to have as much protocol as y'all might think I have. It's not in me. And I love that spirit. And I saw Coretta, as I was reading about Coretta and Martin and her part of the movement, I was thinking about Michelle Obama when I heard her that day take on a protester in a public forum. And so I think these things are just so great. And to know that we had that back then. We had that back then. It was so refreshing.
Yeah. Dr. Howard.
Yes, just to echo a lot of that. I think that one of the things when I was learning, preparing for tonight, just reading Coretta's her autobiography, and in terms of all of what has been said, I think the thing that got me, I remarked to my sister, I was like, I could not have lived back then. It could not have been me, because of the position that she was placed in, with the fact that, she had to tell her husband, I have a voice too. This is, I am passionate about this work as well. And her coming to the realization that, the type of wife that he wanted, who was going to be, I believe the words were that he wanted someone who was, that would take care of that would be a homemaker and take care of his children, but also, of course, be, cultured and educated as well. And in my mind, I'm just like, she had all of these things, and but because she knew that his work was so important and she was dedicated to the work of the movement, she put that first. She knew that she had that whatever was for the good of the movement, that was the big thing. And so I think it just gets again to that voice of that idea of that you have this purpose. She felt that there was a calling on her life, and that was, to be a part of this movement and to push for social justice. And it's really sad that it took afterwards, or as Dr. Allen talked about, for her social activism, which she always cared about. If you read about her, like these issues, a lot of the ones that she fought for, women's rights, the equal rights, a lot of those were things that were within her already. It's just that she didn't necessarily have the platform. She wasn't able to have the platform because of having to be first and foremost to everyone else be Mrs. King. She did, I think it was interesting, she did mention that that there were times when she, like, for example, there was a conference, a women's conference, I think in Europe, and that Dr. King encouraged her to actually go. So she did try to be involved when she could, but, she also had to be a mother. She was a full-time mother. So that also was a big piece of it. But thinking about it in terms of today, I think she serves as an example that when you, this idea of that when you have a purpose and a calling, I think that looking at what she did later on in her life, basically, it sort of gets at the idea that you can do that. It's important for you to basically do that. Don't stifle that because of what other people have told you are supposed to do, what these roles that other people put on you. You need to be able to follow that and listen to that. So I think it would have been, if this was a different time, if it was a different time back then, it's just to think about the things that she might have been able to do, because it was definitely a different time and different, even like with Dr. Allen was talking about some of the opposition that she faced with some of Dr. King's former aides. It's just like, I feel like there's that patriarchy that she coming up again that she had to deal with. And not saying the patriarchy is gone, because goodness knows it's not, but at the same time, just a different era. And it would have been, she was an amazing woman. And I just can only imagine what she would have been able to do if it was a different era.
Yeah. I'm going to come right back to you because I have another question for you about something from your presentation. But Dr. Allen, if you had anything to share about just her legacy or her impact in your own life or anything along those lines. No, we can't hear you. So I will try and come back to you. I promise I'll try and come back. Dr. Howard, let's go to just the other question about when we talk about her impact and the role that she played in so many things. I was just reading an article that was quoting, I think, from her autobiography, where she had a conversation with Dr. King after their home was bombed, and he remarked on her strength and how he needed her strength in that moment, and her statement that she always knew that she was strong, but she was surprised to hear that this man who she also knew was strong needed her in that moment, and how humbling and meaningful that was to her. But also when we go back to the conversation with Kennedy, there's also a quote from the senior Martin Luther King, who said that because Kennedy was willing to wipe the tears from my daughter's eyes, I've got a suitcase full of votes and I'm going to take them to Mr. Kennedy and dump them on his lap. So I wonder if you would think that we could arguably state that it was her influence and her direct action in that moment in intervening for her husband that turned the tide of the Black vote in this country. We heard about how 70% of Black voters whether they were shifting their vote or not, voted for Kennedy in that election, and just the importance of that. So can you talk a little bit more about the significance of her role in the political movement?
With regard to that in particular, I think that with that particular incident, from everything that I've read, it was more so that the call took place, and then afterwards she shared it with her mother-in-law, and basically from there, word, of course, got out. She, just even from her own words, reading about it, which she had like maybe 2-3 pages talking about the call, if that, basically, it wasn't, there didn't seem to be a direct, if anything, I would say that the influence that she had with that would be the fact that, you know, she told everybody and the word spread, like, this is what happened. And then, you know, behind the scenes, things were also taking place that led to his being freed. But I wouldn't say necessarily, at least from her own account, that there was a mobilization directly that she put the call out. The meeting, the quote that you gave with Dr. King's father, that definitely is something that consistently came up because of he said that at a huge meeting that was standing room only, I believe, at Ebenezer Baptist Church, at his church. And that was really one of kind of the impetus. I think that her telling people about that and just saying, yes, he did call me and he comforted me and said that he could be of any assistance. And I think sometimes when you say something as simple as that, particularly in terms of the media, people definitely, the story grows and it goes bigger from that way. And it's like, oh, this gesture significant, shows that there was caring. But just in terms of in fact, that was a question that I had in preparing for this, because I'm just like, when I was redoing my research, this story didn't really seem to center Mrs. King, because it didn't seem like she really did. This wasn't, like I said, she barely mentioned it. It was other sources really that got into the nitty gritty with it. It was, so in terms of her, like, she definitely had a lot of, you know, she was more active in terms of, I would say, political mobilization maybe later on. But with this particular incident, it was more so of the issue of my husband is in jail and I'm panicking about it, and her just simply sharing that information. And again, like I mentioned, there was silence coming. Like, there was no one else, like the Republicans who they, you know, again, Dr. King had talked to, like he actually had more of, I guess, what you could say, a relationship with Nixon versus not having a relationship with Kennedy. So it's sort of like that the way that action of the call shifted things in that sense, that there was silence, and then all of a sudden you have this call of concern. And from there, it's like, well, this is something. This means that he might be. And then further on, even Dr. King had mentioned that, you know, now that we've given him this vote, then that means that, you know, we need to let him know that we expect him to carry through on standing for civil rights. So in a lot of ways, it felt like a snowball effect, I would have to say, that just sort of grew from there.
Yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm. Dr. Allen, do you have your audio back?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Fine. Good. The one thing I was going to say that Coretta Scott King always fought and was one of the people who was willing to say the civil movement is built on the backs of women, but it's men who are basically peacocking. And we forget that it is bakers, it is people who are making chicken sandwiches. You get it's the mothers. You forget that all of these other things. So really, I believe Ella Baker said Malcolm didn't make the movement. Not Malcolm. Martin didn't make the movement. It was the movement that made Lord, I keep mixing them. Martin. And really, you see her in her legacy. Like, she never out. She was always who she was. I just think that sometimes the way that we write history is from the perspective of the dominant patriarchy, right? And not necessarily about who were making things to fund, you know, the travel of MLK and some of his aides as well. I think a thing that's super important is that long before she met Martin, she was so progressive when you think about a Black girl from the South being willing to date a Jewish guy from the North, that is super, can't overlook that. And her commitment, like seeing past the to people, I think is also super important about this. Then it allows her to meet with AIDS in South Africa. Her commitment and her basically her consistency and her that allows her to drop seeds of nonviolence globally, so that we have a peaceful transition of Nelson Mandela when he is elected, or even her talking to Winnie Mandela, or some of the, I can't remember the young lady, but her last name, I believe, starts with Gandhi. She was like the first prime minister of India. And it allows her to drop these seeds of nonviolence. And then the other super important thing is that Coretta basically lived in a season of assassinations. So what must that have been like to still have to keep nonviolence when your friends and your associates are being picked off one by one? And to continue that, and to continue to stand. What does it look like when the people who walked with your husband, who were so enamored with your husband and his work, Jesse Jackson, Abernathy, Hosea Williams, the politicians who loved Martin or what he looked like or what he could give them, how you undermine the wife who is actually doing work? What must that have felt like? And how strong do you have to be? Because I'm gonna tell you, I'm still learning the 6 principles of nonviolence.
You know, in that piece, I remember when Dr. King died, I was 7 years old. And I remember watching the funeral. You know, we had to watch the funeral. I went to a segregated school, and we watched the video of the funeral. And I just remember one of the reporters, as they saw Bernice lying on Coretta, and Bernice asked the question, and the reporter is talking about this and said, "Mama, do we have to love the guy who killed Daddy?" And she said, yes. So Dr. Allen, you know, talking about nonviolent and being spiritually called and grounded, her, you know, she, you know, we say she's a mother because she wants to make sure that she's got some students, some children that are grounded morally in human rights and human behavior and the love for mankind. Sometimes I wonder, as I was reading her autobiography, I was wondering, well, I know God put them two together because she was the splitting image of him and what he was trying to accomplish. There was no better partner for her or for him than her. Someone who understood, who could fight through the sexism that she was up against, to couch it in a way that she could pick her battles and still not have this women's movement and this civil rights movement in conflict with each other, accomplishing nothing. So she had to balance that where we could grow together. And I thought she did that well, I tell you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to call in actually our host, Miss Bernadine, because I think we've heard reference before to her connection with the Kings. And I just wanted to ask about any experiences that she had with Mrs. King, or just to wrap up or bring us back to that question of her influence in your life or her inspiration.
Definitely an influence. She was my Sarah, and prior to, I really didn't have a choice about what I was going to pledge. My mother was AKA, and I grew up in a pink brick home. My bedroom was pink, so I guess it was destiny. But to hear my mother speak of Mrs. King, and she and Dr. King spent a lot of time in Savannah. It was a quick getaway from them. He loved the beach, and she would often accompany him. It's interesting that in the many times that Dr. King was at the house, Mrs. King was never there, because he would come to have those visits to get away, but at the same time, it was like a working vacation to also talk over a hot breakfast about what were the next plans for the movement. But I do recall one of what I guess Savannah considers one of its most monumental moments of Mrs. King being in Savannah. She did a concert, a fundraiser concert at St. John Baptist Church. And that was the highlight of conversation many weeks after that concert. And people from all over came to hear her perform. And it was a mini operetta, as how they referred to it. So, but I would go to college, go to Bennett College, and have an opportunity to meet her as I was becoming a young woman and coming into myself and coming into my purpose. And I think that's when I really appreciated who she was. Not just as a Sarah, but as a Black woman, and to be in her presence really was to be in the presence of royalty. That's the only way I can describe it. My godmother shared today, because she knew about this broadcast, and she had a very dear friend. And they went to school in California, USC, if I'm saying it correctly, Irvine, and Mrs. King visited, and my godmother talked about how her friend just sat at the feet of Mrs. King, and how touching that was. And that is, she was very regal, and that's she just had a presence that was just regal, but powerful. And so that is what I remember most. I think as we come to the end of this broadcast, Sister Coral and I have been talking a lot. This month, the reoccurring theme seems to come up of women supporting women, and how important that is. And in supporting women, how important it is to also celebrate women and to acknowledge their accomplishments and who they are. And I think this has been a very befitting way to honor Dr. King and his First Lady, Queen Coretta Scott King, to acknowledge her influence and her power and her strength. Very quiet. She was just very demure, but there was something powerful in that quietness, in that resolve. And so you knew when she began to speak that she was going to say something very meaningful. And so I'm very grateful that we could have this opportunity to celebrate her legacy, and to celebrate her wisdom and her strength. And I see a lot of those qualities in you ladies that I have the honor of sharing the screen with this evening. As we end, and I'm being reminded that we do have to keep in mind that there would be no holiday if it were not for her work and for her persistence and that of her children, because I can remember, and I have lots of King stories with the children, but I, for her to have raised those kids or children through the movement and through the struggle and hardship, and to keep them engaged in the fight as well, not an easy feat. So it just all speaks to who she was as a Black woman, and I think we all can attest to that. So at the end of this, I'm going to put up something, because as I said, women support women. And Sister Treya, I don't want to put all of your business out there, but I think you will allow me to put some of it out there. Sister Khara, we're doing this broadcast, the Lived Black Experience Project. We just got finished celebrating Kwanzaa. And we did we took all 7 days to talk about the different principles. And then we ended the 7-day celebration with talking about how we wanted to commit ourselves to practicing these principles every day for the next 365 days. So Sister Treya has a daughter that God just simply presented to her. So not by natural birth, but a daughter who came to her by way of the motherland. And so she's here. And Sister Treya, do you want to just quickly share your story?
Yes. I feel like I've been gifted the bonus baby. That's what I call her. This baby, pandemic and some other things have really devastated home. And home is that area. And so we are working together as a community to here in Tucson to sound with love. This bonus lives with me, and now we are raising money for her tuition because her hope is to become a nurse, go on to med school, and then return home to service her community. We are fundraising right now for her tuition at a college here in Tucson, and to shore her up for the next 2 semesters.
So I wanted to, we talked about Kwanzaa and the 7 principles. And so tonight I just want to remind us about Ujima, which is collective responsibility and collective work, and Umoja, which is at the beginning, which is the number 1 Kwanzaa principle, which is unity. And so, as I said, women do support women. We should, at any time that we have an opportunity to reach out and to give a sister strength and to give her leverage. And so that is what I'm asking our LBE community to do this evening. So Sister Queen Treya has started a GoFundMe, and I'm asking that you look within yourself to give to to this sister, and this sister who is trying to raise another sister to become a fellow queen in the royal court. And as an adopted baby, it really touches my heart for anyone who can open up their home and to decide to raise a child that they have not given birth to. I know for a fact, I'm a living testament that is a very special type of love. And so I'm just asking if we can, and I know that we can, because we're not asking you to give a unreasonable amount. Any amount will help, as Sister Treya tries to keep her bonus baby in college and here in this new world, to give her this experience and to give her the love and support that she needs while she is here. And so with that, we say thank you to the Lived Black Experience family, which are our viewers who are from all over. We thank you for your support, and go and be well. Go in grace.